British police now believe that former Russian spy Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia were poisoned with a nerve agent. They are calling it a deliberate act.
This is being treated as a major incident involving attempted murder by administration of a nerve agent. As you know, these two people remain critically ill in hospital. Sadly, in addition, a police officer who was one of the first to attend the scene and respond to the incident is now also in a serious condition in hospital.
Well, these latest revelations raise major questions about who was behind the plot to kill the two. Not anybody can manufacture, can handle nerve agent. You have to know what you're doing. The UK Foreign Secretary vowed that if any foreign power is found responsible, the UK will respond, quote, robustly. Let's bring in our team covering these extraordinary developments. Nick Payton-Walsh joins us from New Scotland Yard. Phil Black is live in Salisbury at the scene. And Nick, first of all, what more do we know about this nerve agent, about the investigation into what, do the police know what substance was used and are not sharing it, or are they still investigating?
Yeah, they're quite clear that they know what specific agent this was, but they are not sharing it. They said today, interesting in the language here, attempted murder with the administering of a nerve agent, that the two people, Sergei and Yulia Skripal, were intentionally targeted. And I've given you a timeline here. It was a Sunday afternoon about 1:30 when they were noticed losing consciousness, clearly ill and distress on a park bench. Now, obviously, the investigation continues. The counter-terrorism chief police officer here in the United Kingdom, Assistant Commissioner Mark Rowley, said that they're specifically looking for people to come forward who were in that area between 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock, a big window on Sunday afternoon in the sort of shopping centre called the Maltings in the rural city, quiet place called Salisbury. There's still a pizza restaurant there, Zizi's, and a pub, the Bishop, that are still sealed off by police. But frankly, this is monumentally changed today from something which in local media on Sunday was perhaps thought to be an accident or an overdose involving fentanyl, a very powerful opioid often available on the street. Now we are talking about a substantial geopolitical crisis here. Remember, this is not the first time Britain's dealt with something like this. Alexander Litvinenko, another former Russian spy, killed in 2006, then with polonium, a very specific radioactive poison. And you have to ask yourself, nerve agents are hard to come by, as you said. VX, sarin, two possible candidates there, but they're only really manufactured or known by a small number of countries, meaning that there are clear fingerprints potentially here leading back, as there were with polonium and Litvinenko, back towards a potential country as the culprit here. Now, of course, police won't go into details about who else they're looking for. They sadly spoke of how one of the first police officers came to the scene is still seriously ill, but you have to ask yourself, as you touched upon there, Hala, who would administer this particular nerve agent? Are they looking at potentially people involved in the restaurants or the bar they were near? Did somebody accost them in the street? How did that person protect themselves from the poison in question? So are they looking for somebody who's also critically ill somewhere in the area around Salisbury? These are key questions. It does sound like police have a few more answers than they're letting on at this particular point. But aside from the murder investigation, I should say attempted murder investigation here, the House of Commons over there will see a statement from the head of sort of British security, Amber Rudd, tomorrow, outlining what they know about this. The broader question is, what does Britain do? UK Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson has promised a robust response if a foreign power was thought to be behind this poisoning. Back when he spoke, he said he had no one to point the finger at. Now possibly they do. So the broad question is, what can Britain, once sort of an imperial power that Russia loathed and competed with, now very much diminished and the recipient of lots of Russian foreign cash, what do they do in a response? Hala?
Sure, we'll look at all those questions in a moment. Phil Black in Salisbury, we saw some CCTV footage there of right before the incident there in Salisbury. What does that tell us, this surveillance footage from just an ordinary convenience store, about what we know about the movements there of Sergei Skripal before this murder attempt?
Well, on one hand, Hala, not very much. It is just a few moments, a tiny slice of Sergei Skripal's life here in Salisbury, just in the days leading up to this particular incident. But it shows him at a convenience store that he was a regular customer at, buying some scratch lottery tickets, some food, some milk, that sort of stuff. Really basic, everyday things in what is, as Nick was touching on, a relatively quiet, small, sleepy city in southern England. It is here that we now understand, really very close to where I am now standing, that a chemical weapon was deployed in a deliberate effort to try and assassinate Sergei Skripal and perhaps his daughter as well. We don't know at this stage whether or not she was a deliberate target or whether or not she was simply collateral damage. But that is the fact that people in this town are now coming to terms with, because where I'm standing is near that shopping area, which on a Sunday afternoon was vibrant, filled with people going about their day in shops, restaurants and pubs and so forth. And we know that this weapon did pose a wider risk to just those targeted, because one of the police officers who first assisted them is now seriously ill in hospital as well because of his exposure to it, Hannah.
All right, Phil Black in Salisbury, thanks very much. And Nick Payton-Walsh at New Scotland Yard. This case has put renewed scrutiny on a string of Russian-linked deaths in the UK in recent years. But are we jumping to conclusions here? My next guest has investigated all of them. She says the UK has turned a blind eye to assassinations on its soil and has instead tried to protect the Kremlin, and with it, Russian investment in the UK. Heidi Blake is the UK investigations editor for BuzzFeed News, and she's here in the studio. Thanks for being with us. When I ask, are we jumping to conclusions? This is a man who was convicted in Russia, but he was later pardoned. Presumably, MI6 would have spoken to him at length at the time. He would have told them everything he knows. Why would Russia today target someone like him? Does it make sense?
Well, I think what you have to weigh in the balance here is the fact that for Vladimir Putin, he is a KGB man himself. That's the tradition that he comes from, and part of the way in which the KGB and now the FSB, its successor agency, enforces its dominance and its power is that if you betray Russia, if you betray in particular the FSB, the Russian security state, then you'll be at risk for the rest of your life.
We saw him in CCTV footage, didn't seem to have protection, was going about his day. Sergei Skripal, his daughter, was visiting from Russia. It just looked kind of like an ordinary routine for him.
Right. And,
is that surprising to you?
Well, we understand that he opted to live under his own identity and without protection. That is a choice that some defectors make. He did have protection from MI6, as far as we understand it. But yeah, he was going about living a fairly regular life. I mean, I speak to lots of people in the community of Russian exiles living here in the UK, many of whom are under protection from Scotland Yard and or MI6, and who are under constant threat of assassination, who receive intelligence that their lives are at risk all the time, but who just have to find a way of normalizing that.
And let's talk a little bit about the idea that nerve agent was used here in this assassination attempt. When I say not anybody knows how to manufacture and handle nerve agent, this really just gives us lots of clues as to who or what entity could be behind this.
That's right. One of the things we know about Russia is that it has, the Russian state has a poison factory outside Moscow, which is devoted to the research and development of obscure chemical and biological weapons for specific use in targeted assassinations. They have a vast arsenal of poisons at their disposal, and so when we know a little bit more about exactly what agent has been used here, it might tell us a little more about whether it's likely to have come from that factory.
And there are previous murders that were linked to Russia where, for instance, polonium-210 was used and different. This nerve agent development, what does it tell you specifically? Has this been already, in your reporting, have you found it that this type of poison was used before in political assassinations?
Well, some of what we've learned about the other cases we've investigated, there are 14 in total on British soil, is that some of these people are suspected by intelligence agencies of having been poisoned. We know that Russia has at its disposal chemicals that cause, for example, heart attacks or can trigger fast-developing cancers. And in this case, this appears to be some kind of a nerve agent that shuts down the nervous system very, very quickly. So those are the sorts of weapons which are likely only to be at the disposal of a state as opposed to, say, an organised crime group, a mafia group, which is why I think all fingers right now are pointing at the Kremlin.
Sure. And obviously non-state actors, why would they even risk handling this type of agent as well when there are other ways you could go about? Now, if indeed it is found, one of the things that you've reported on is that the UK doesn't always respond proportionally to murders and assassinations committed on its soil. Why not?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, in the case of Alexander Litvinenko back in 2006, as you say, he was poisoned with radioactive polonium. The government did take a relatively firm line and accuse the Kremlin of carrying out or being involved in that assassination. They really didn't have any option. It was such a brazen assassination. It was, you know, using radioactive material in the capital city. It left a radioactive trail all over London. But in the other 14 cases we've looked at, many of which have occurred since then, the police have declared all of these deaths non-suspicious, despite some of them being, you know, extremely brazen. In one case, somebody was stabbed to death multiple times with 2 different knives, and the police said it was a suicide. In another, somebody dropped dead and was found to have a rare plant poison in his stomach. Again, the police said that was a death by natural causes. The reason we think...
Please go ahead.
Our understanding from speaking to multiple sources on both sides of the Atlantic is that the British government has been unwilling to antagonise the Kremlin by making accusations, keen to preserve the flow of Russian money into British banks and properties, and genuinely nervous of enraging a Russia which is increasingly developing cyber capabilities which could shut down swathes of British infrastructure.
Last question related to this specific case. Some have asked, why use such a weapon when it can obviously be traced back to, you know, a potentially state-sponsored initiative? Why not just do something that's more discreet, less traceable?
I think that's a great question, and it seems that this is such a brazen act that it can only be a deliberate provocation, especially not just going for Sergei Skripal, but also targeting his daughter, a completely innocent party. You know, that does look like an act of provocation by Putin, who has been making increasingly bold and brazen moves in the West and making provocative statements. So I think this is a real test for the British government as to how are they going to deal with a Russia that's making such brazen moves.
Well, Boris Johnson says they will, if they can trace back the trail back to the perpetrator, that they will respond robustly. We'll see if that happens. Heidi Blake, thanks so much of BuzzFeed.
Thank you.
Great having you on the program.